Welcome back. We are going to finish this lecture series on hay production with talking about storage and feeding of hay. And hay storage is an exercise in managing weather damage. Now, I want to start out by talking about these two different scenarios that you can see in this picture. In the upper one, can you tell what is going on there? Got round bales of hay with tin on top held down by rocks. And I saw this in about 1991 or 2 or 3. And if I could have found the farmer, I'd have gotten off and shaken his hand, because I mean, that is a commitment to keep the water off of hay bales. Now, unfortunately, this farmer would have missed one of the crucial points, and that is most of the water, most of the damage comes in from below the hay bale. And so he kept the water off the top, but he's going to get some water damage from soaking it up into the bottom of those hay bales. So if you look at the picture at the bottom, we've got net wrap bales of hay, but put on, you've got a limestone base, and then you've got tires laid out here that these bales are sitting on, so they're effectively kept off of direct contact with the ground, and breaking contact with the ground makes the biggest difference in outside stored hay. So this is some work that was done here at the University of Kentucky. It compares several different storage systems from inside storage, and this has a system life and an approximate cost. These costs are quite old, so they're relatively right, but they were probably written, this was probably written 20 or 25 years ago. So then you get into a pole structure with a plastic roof on a pad. So we've got basically a hoop structure. Then you got a reusable tarp on a pad all the way down to stacked on the ground and twine tied bales. And if you look at the dry matter loss, the sheds or the hoop structures, or the reusable tarp on a pad on the ground, or even a bale sleeve, which would be like a plastic wrapped bale that, and also plastic wrap on the ground, is going to have almost the same amount of dry matter loss. So all these systems, as long as we're breaking contact with the ground and keeping the water out of the bale, then these are going to be quite effective in terms of minimizing dry matter loss in storage. When we have an elevated stack outside on a pad, you've still got water infiltrating from the top, but we've got rock and filter fabric underneath. We've mitigated the damage to somewhere between 13 and 17% dry matter loss. Just net wrap alone is better than twine tied bales alone. So you get an advantage. The net wrapping does, in fact, move some water off the top, and it does serve as somewhat of a barrier below the bale, but not very effective. The greater the moisture content at baling, the greater the loss. And there's a rule of thumb, and it's at the bottom, and that is that dry matter losses in storage are approximately equal to the baling moisture minus the equilibrium moisture content, and that's about 15% in Kentucky. So remember, I told you that hay, when we make it, goes through a sweat, and that sweat comes from plant respiration and microbial activity, and that microbial activity causes a heat. That heat drives off this moisture drives off the excess moisture until we get to equilibrium moisture. So if we're baling between 15 and 20% moisture, our dry matter loss is going to be about 1 to 5%. If we're above 20, then we're 5+%, and it's how much more than 5 we gets into this formula. So if we baled at 25% moisture, we'd expect 10% dry matter losses in storage, just simply due to the plant respiration and microbial activity that comes to drive off that extra 10% of moisture. Another important thing to know is the better the hay, the more it suffers outside. And here we've got two types of hay, grass or grass legume, sheltered or unweathered, in other words, stored inside, or weathered, and you can tell that the digestibility changes quite a bit, as does the crude protein. Here's a phenomenon you're going to see, and I had not thought about this in a while. you will actually, it is possible to have weathered bales that are this weathered. In other words, losing from 60% digestibility down to 40, which is huge. You can actually see the crude protein content go up. And the reason for that is that the nitrogen is preserved, but all of the energy is burned off. In other words, the bale is smaller, so that the proportion of nitrogen to the total bale is higher, even though there's not really more pounds of protein, but the bale is smaller. So anyway, not to confuse you, usually you would say that the more a bale heats and the more it's weathered, the worse it is, and that's true. But in this case, the parameter you're going to talk about is going to be digestibility and acid detergent fiber. So the quantity of fiber goes up. And again, the pounds of fiber in that, there's not more fiber, pounds of fiber there, but what happens is that the carbohydrates that are there have been chewed up and changed into carbon dioxide, which evolves out of the bale, and then you get this same pounds of fiber winds up being a greater proportion of the bale, and it happened in both types of hay. Now that's a complex concept, and I hope it didn't confuse you. But just simply remember that better hay suffers more outside. But you can see this phenomenon where crude protein goes up because you have burned off a good bit of the hay bale. This is not a better bit of hay for you, because the limiting factor in this kind of hay is this energy. In fact, when we get to that section in this course, you're going to find that energy is the single biggest limiting factor in forage quality with forage crops, period. If you get the energy right, almost 9.5 times out of 10, the protein is going to be in excess. Another point I want to leave with you is that weathering hurts small bales more. Now, I've drawn a line here at 4 inches of spoilage depth. This would be outside stored hay. If the bale diameter is 3 feet, then that means we've lost about 40% of the bale. And that's because if you do the geometry, there is more, for every inch you go inside the bale, that inch at the outside of the bale is more hay than an inch at the inside of the bale. So then at 4 feet, if it's a 4 feet bale, 4 foot in radius bale, 4 foot tall bale, then we lose 4 inches. It's only 30%. 5 feet, we're down to 23 or 4%. If it's 6 feet tall and we lose 4 inches, we've only lost 1/5 of the bale. So the bigger the bale, the more spoilage the less weather does in terms of the proportion of the bale, because more of the bale is in the middle. More of the bale is in the middle. Then I want to cover just one example of covered storage being the best, and that we've talked about that before. That some sort of covered storage where we break in the contact with the ground. In this case, this is a hoop structure over filter fabric and gravel. So this storage system is as effective as anything, any pole barn, any structure you could build. And we have built a lot of these in Kentucky, and you're about to see why in this. This is a 30 by 72 foot hoop structure on gravel. Turnkey cost was $9,500. The contractor came in and did everything: site prep, filter fabric, gravel, everything, $9,500. If you divide that winds up coming out to be about $4.40 per square foot of space for this barn. A couple of points about it. Ventilation is crucial. You need these side walls on it, but you also need to have a way for air to come here and move up, because this is going to heat, and there'll be a lot of air, a lot of heat moving up to the top of this. You're going to want air to be able to move up from the sides up and to the top, and then through these structures. You're going to want this bottom barrier down to keep the bales from direct contact with the ground. In this case, it has a capacity of 210 of these 1,200 pound bales. They are 5 by 5s or 126 tons. So I've done a little math here. This 5 by 5 bale, if we have a 2 inch loss, 13% dry matter loss. If we have a 4-inch loss, it's about 25% loss, 36 and 46. We've applied this then to this calculation to try to figure out what are the economics of this hoop structure. So here's the 2, 4, 6, and 8-inch loss. Here's the hay value, 40, 60, 80, and $100 per ton, 126 tons. If we lose 2 inches on every bale, then if we were comparing to outside storage, if you only lost 2 inches on every bale, then and your hay was worth $40, you only saved $650 a year. If you lost 2 inches on bales stored outside and your hay was $100 a ton, that's $1,624 of hay lost in a year. If you've got 4 inches of loss for outside storage, or 6, which is more normal, then you're looking at a loss between $1,254 for per ton, up to, or for 126 tons, excuse me, up to $3,136 if your hay was valuable. So if you look at that versus our $9,500 total, how long does it take to get paid back? Here's taking that same information. Here's the number of years it takes to get paid back to compare outside storage to inside storage at different losses of hay and different costs per ton. So if you think $60 a ton, that's a reasonable number, and 4 inches a loss, then it took 5 years to recoup the cost of building that structure, and the life of that structure would be quite a bit longer than 5 years, depending on the frequency of some really heavy hailstorms or maybe tornadoes. So it takes about 5 years or so. In about 5 years, it'd be relatively easy then to recoup the costs of building a hoop structure. So we're going to talk briefly about hay feeding and remind you of some things that Dr. Higgins talked about. Of course, this is the kind of the worst case scenario, and I think Dr. Higgins even used this picture where you have hay put out in a common feeding area, and there is no ring feeder, there's no limiting access, and you can see that they're actually defecating on it, urinating on it, laying on it. It's becoming bedding. So in Steve Higgins' figures, there was only about 50% of this consumed, and 50% of it was wasted. One system I want to bring to your attention is something called bale grazing, where we actually put bales out in the fall before we get into the bad weather of winter, and use temporary electric fence then to ration that out throughout the winter. And all we're doing to feed hay is to go out and then move electric fence and allow animals, such as right back here, then access to 2 or 3 bales of this hay. And there we're spreading out the damage from feeding hay. And we're also not moving tractors across the field. So this can improve the soil fertility because we're moving that manure and urine across the field, especially if the hay is coming from off the farm, okay? Because that means we're bringing those nutrients in from hay onto the farm. And it can lessen the mud and the impact on water quality. You can see that we still have a good bit of grass cover here in this area where we fed already, and it minimizes equipment damage to pastures. This is actually some data from a Dare County study. Started out with low phosphorus numbers and fairly low potassium numbers, and then fed and used and measured the soil fertility within the bale feeding areas and outside. And of course, there is these up in the table in the upper right. We've got the P and K of the pre and the post. So the pre, the control was not where they had no bale grazing, and then, or the control was before and then after. So that our P numbers went from, the pre was 30, and it went up to, it went up to 90, and we went from 104 to 349 in terms of pounds of K per acre. So you can see we can have a large effect on soil fertility by bringing hay and feeding it in those areas. And you can see that the improvement in soil fertility it's hard to see here, but this is broom sedge outside of the bale feeding areas inside of the bale feeding areas where the manure and urine is, and the increase in P and K, then you've got grass but no brim sedge. We followed up with that producer and next year, and he made some adjustments. He gave himself more space per bale. He had an issue with the water point, and they kept having to go back to the same point for water. He did have good manure distribution, and he figures that he lost 33% of production around the bales in the first year, or about 800 pounds of dry matter. So he figured up the area in these killed areas where that he fed, and he did have some losses, and that is a problem, and those require some reseeding. But yet it is a way to avoid getting tractors and implements out on heavy equipment. And of course, this is a good time to remind you that was Steve Higgins' whole point about using those cubbies and those fence line feeders, is that you've got to keep the tractors on the gravel on the road, and you keep them out of the field making mud, and you then have a high traffic or a heavy traffic pad area to support the cattle as they access the hay. And you wind up with a very efficient system environmentally, and also in terms of efficient in terms of less waste. And I'll just cut to the chase. This is a ring feeder that has the sheeting at the bottom and something to keep them from pulling the hay out, compared to the cone, or this is a cone on the right. I'm sorry. Ring feeder on the left, the traditional ring feeder, where they can pull hay out, and they will. You have about 20% loss when you feed hay in this system versus 5% in this system. So even using the type of feeder, even the type of feeder that you use will make a difference in terms of your losses. So this brings us to the end of a 3-part lecture on hay production and feeding. When we get together next, we will begin our discussion on haylage systems, and in particular, we will be talking about making high moisture round baled silage. So I look forward to seeing you then. Take care.